What if I told you that Ferrari discovered that everything they believed about Lewis Hamilton's car was a lie? What your simulator, your data, and even your strategic decisions were based on false information. What happened after the race in the Netherlands not only shook the foundations of the team, but can change the entire 2025 season. The 2025 Grand Prix began under an environment of apparent normality for Ferrari. The Italian team reached Zandvoort's layout with reasonable expectations. They had worked intensely in the data collected during the first 2 dates of the calendar, and they trusted that their car, the SF25, would finally begin to respond as expected. In theory, the layout favored the technical characteristics of the car: medium radio curves, constant direction changes, and sectors that reward traction and balance. But what happened from the first day of activity was disconcerting. The first signs that something was not going well manifested in free training sessions. They were not obvious failures or catastrophic errors. They were small deviations in the behavior of the car that, although subtle, were persistent and difficult to explain. The engineers noticed that Lewis Hamilton's car showed erratic behaviors in curves where, according to previous simulation, it should be perfectly stable. The initial analysis sought guilty in external factors: changes in the direction and pressure of the wind, variations in asphalt temperature, even the use of tire compounds with a thermal range different from the estimate. But nothing square. SF25 telemetry showed contradictory data. Sectors where time gain was expected, they turned out to be points of loss. Curves that were modeled as neutral in the simulator were survivors or with a tendency to sudden sliding. And the most serious, any attempt to correct those imbalances through fine adjustments in the car settings ended up aggravating the situation. Each modification based on virtual predictions was not only useless but counterproductive. Hamilton, experienced as few to interpret track sensations, began to raise his voice. According to its perception, the car reacted completely different from what the simulator promised. The problem was not simply that the car was difficult to drive, it was that he behaved as if it were another car. On each lap, the pilot's confidence decreased, at the same time as the uncertainty of the technical team increased. This forced Ferrari to take an unusual measure. They decided to momentarily stop the future simulations and begin to cross the data in real time with historical references and previous configurations of the car, including parameters collected from the preseason tests. It was then that they discovered an alarming pattern. Hamilton's car was not badly configured, he was acting under a completely erroneous set of premises. The entire development process from aerodynamic balance predictions to curve load analysis had been built on a deeply defective simulation. At that time, what seemed like a complex weekend became an alert signal that touched the base of Ferrari's technical operation. It was no longer about correcting a failed configuration, but about facing the possibility that all the knowledge accumulated in its simulation infrastructure was false. The discovery would open the door to a much deeper investigation, whose consequences would go far beyond the Zandvoort Grand Prix. The moment of greatest impact for Ferrari did not occur on the track, but in the technical intimacy of its data centers. After verifying that the behavior of the SF25 of Lewis Hamilton during the weekend in Zandvoort did not coincide with any of the scenarios projected by the simulator, the technical team made a decision that would change the course of its season: to review from scratch all the flow of information that supported the development and strategy operation of the car. The investigation began as a simple security check: verify that the car sensors were transmitting consistent data. But it quickly became a complete audit of the system. What they found was disturbing. It was not a punctual error. There was no disconnected sensor or a corrupted file. It was an interconnected chain of errors that, together, had produced a false image of the car from the first day of their conception. The database that fed the predictive models of the SF25 was contaminated. What engineers saw on the screen was a carefully structured illusion, and deeply wrong. One of the most serious findings was the erroneous calibration of the sensors responsible for collecting data on the structural rigidity of the car and its behavior under lateral load. This information is essential to determine how the chassis behaves in curve, how the weight between axes is transferred, and how the suspensions interact with the asphalt. The erroneous interpretation of this data led to virtual simulations that simply did not reflect physical reality. In essence, the simulator projected a car that did not exist. A car with characteristics that, on track, never appeared. To this was added another even more technical problem. The mathematical model in charge of replicating the conditions of the circuits was also outdated and presented errors in its interpretation of dynamic variables, such as the undulation of the track, the progressive degradation of the tire, or the evolution of the grip with the passage of the laps. As a result, Ferrari designed a car for an environment that only existed in its computers, not in the real world. Each simulator turn was a false promise. Each performance prediction was a silent betrayal. This revelation was devastating for the team, not only because of the immediate technical damage, but by the coup to the morals and credibility of its simulation department. For years, Ferrari had invested hundreds of millions of euros in technology to reach the top of the modern F1. However, all that effort was sabotaged from within by a series of systematic failures that no one knew or wanted to see in time. What was previously a reliable development tool became an invisible enemy that had diverted to the team for months. And worst of all, this did not affect Hamilton's car. All SF25's development philosophy was infected. These types of errors not only explain the low performance in Zandvoort, but also the inconsistencies that Ferrari had been dragging since the beginning of the season without being able to resolve. With this revealed betrayal, Ferrari faced one of the deepest technical crises in its modern history. And what would come next would only further aggravate the situation. While Ferrari tried to assimilate the devastating blow that meant discovering the corruption of his simulation system, a new crisis chapter emerged, this time even more delicate. An internal conflict that would compromise the integrity of the equipment and fracture confidence between pilot and engineers. What began as a routine review of the SF25 technical parameters became a much more serious investigation when unauthorized alterations were discovered in Lewis Hamilton's car during the weekend of the Grand Prix of the Netherlands. The finding was disturbing. Two fundamental parameters of the car had been modified between Friday night and Saturday morning, just before the classification. And the most alarming of all is that these modifications were made without the knowledge or approval of Hamilton himself. In a sport where the confidence between the pilot and his career engineer is almost sacred, this act represented an unprecedented ethical rupture. The first modification was the rear conduction height, also known as rear ride height. This parameter defines the distance between the rear of the car and the ground, and is critical for multiple aspects of performance. From the aerodynamic efficiency of the diffuser to the braking stability, through the general balance of the car in changes of direction. A change of just millimeters can completely alter the dynamic behavior of the car. And that was exactly what happened. Hamilton reported from the first laps of Saturday that the car felt unstable, that the rear axle responded abruptly, and that he could not trust the grip when he left curve. All of that coincided with a car whose aerodynamic pressure center had been displaced without prior notice. The second alteration was on the differential map. The differential regulates how the power between the rear wheels of the car is transferred, and its configuration directly affects the traction in the exit of the curves. When modifying this map without adapting the rest of the car, a critical unbalance was introduced in the transition between acceleration and braking, something that pilots immediately perceive as a loss of control. For a Hamilton-caliber pilot, which bases its driving style on the extreme sensitivity of the rear axle, this change left it completely out of time. The suspicions quickly fell on Riccardo Adami, the career engineer assigned to Hamilton after his arrival in Ferrari. According to internal sources, Adami would have authorized these changes based on an interpretation of Friday data, convinced that they would be an improvement for classification. But he did it without consulting with the pilot and without formally informing the chief engineer's team. In Ferrari's hierarchical structure, this is a serious transgression, since it puts at risk not only the sport's integrity of the car, but also the professional relationship with the pilot, and by extension, the cohesion of the entire team. Hamilton's reaction was immediate and forceful. The seven-time world champion demanded explanations from the technical department and requested an emergency meeting with Vasseur, the team director. At that meeting, Hamilton not only expressed his discontent, but openly questioned the internal communication system and the lack of control over technical decisions that directly affect their performance. Sources close to paddock affirmed that the atmosphere in Maranello during that weekend was tense, with closed-door discussions and growing media pressure that began to filter conflict details. The storm that unleashed in Zandvoort was not simply a matter of technical errors or questionable decisions. It was a deep attention call to one of the most emblematic and powerful teams in the history of Formula One. Ferrari, with all its legacy, its resources and its talent, was exposed. And not in front of a rival, but before herself. The reality that came to light in the Grand Prix of the Netherlands revealed something much more worrying than a poorly balanced car. A technical structure that had become vulnerable, a disorganized chain of command, and an operational philosophy that needed a root review. The great unknown is not whether they can do it, but if they are willing to pay the price that implies recognizing that something so essential was broken from the beginning.